Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable, sleep, or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influences, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep. Chapter 1: The Midnight Watch and Humble Rest. The medieval world, stripped bare of artificial light, allowed the human body to reconnect with its ancient rhythms. Imagine the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, then fading to a velvety blackness far deeper than anything most of us experience today. In this profound darkness, most people, from the humblest peasant to the busiest merchant, would turn in early. Their homes, often small and drafty, offered little to entice them to stay awake. The flickering, sooty flame of a single candle or the dying embers of a hearth provided scant illumination, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. As the last duties of the day were completed, perhaps a simple meal shared or a final check on the animals, they would drift off into what was known as the first sleep. This initial period of rest was typically deep and undisturbed, lasting for about 4 hours. It was a time of true physical repose, a heavy slumber born of strenuous labor and the sheer absence of external stimulation. Then something curious would happen. Without the insistent glow of a street lamp or the endless scroll of a phone screen, the body would naturally stir. After those initial 4 hours, people would wake up. This wasn't a groggy, disoriented awakening, nor was it considered a sign of insomnia or a restless mind. It was a deliberate, accepted part of the nightly rhythm. For the next hour or two, they would engage in what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This was the watch period, a quiet interlude between the two main segments of sleep, and it was considered perfectly normal, practical, and often quite useful. You might find a farmer tending to a small symbolic fire in the hearth, adding a piece of wood, or simply stirring the embers to keep the fragile warmth alive in the cold night air. The gentle crackle and faint scent of wood smoke would fill the quiet home. Perhaps they would check on their livestock, listening intently for any unusual sounds from the small shed attached to the dwelling, because nothing ruins your REM cycle quite like the worry that your goat might have wandered off. This was also a common time for prayer. For many, especially the devout, the quiet of the night offered an ideal opportunity for spiritual communion. They might light a small, carefully guarded lamp and read religious texts, their lips moving silently over familiar psalms, finding solace in the rhythmic cadence of the words. It was a time for reflection, for quiet contemplation, and for seeking divine comfort. Marriage manuals and medieval physicians even noted that this interlude, when the body was well rested and the mind calm, was considered the ideal time for intimacy. It sounds like a polite, perhaps even practical way of saying they were too tired to argue, or perhaps simply too exhausted from the day's labor to be spontaneous at any other time. If you ever thought you were romantic for waking up early to make your partner coffee, just know your ancestors were setting the bar very differently. The second sleep would follow this interlude, lasting until sunrise. Everyone from the cloistered monk to the field-worn farmer participated in this nightly rhythm. Even literary figures like Chaucer casually mentioned it, which means that, yes, even in medieval literature, people were writing about not sleeping properly. Not in the sense of being sleep-deprived, but simply acknowledging this distinct two-part cycle. Oddly enough, modern science has suggested that segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans, aligning with how our circadian rhythms work in the absence of artificial light. So, the next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't panic. Just whisper, "Ah yes, the watch has begun," and go tend a symbolic fireplace, or perhaps quietly reflect on your day. It wasn't until the industrial era, with its relentless factories, bright gas lamps, and the growing fear of unproductivity, that humans began to enforce the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours, as though sleep were a timed sport. In the medieval world, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't failure, it was the schedule, and everyone was on it, whether they liked it or not. Now let's talk about beds, or rather, the medieval approximation of them. In today's world, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether a mattress is cloud-like. In medieval Europe, a bed was often just a pile of stuff that used to be alive, now flattened under the weight of poor sleep and unspoken regrets. The typical peasant bed consisted of a straw mattress, known as a pallet. This was literally straw or hay stuffed into a sack of rough fabric. If they had the luxury of a sack, if not, it was just straw on the floor, possibly damp, possibly already claimed by a cat or a very determined mouse. These pallets were not comfortable by any modern standard, but they were better than nothing, which was the most common alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and good at insulating against the cold, providing a thin barrier against the unforgiving chill of a stone floor or earthen ground. It was also, unfortunately, great at harboring insects, lice, and the occasional field mouse, which made sleeping an exercise in cautious stillness. If it itched, you ignored it. If it bit, you just shifted slightly and hoped for the best, perhaps mumbling a quiet prayer for relief. The rustling sound of the straw as you turned, the faint earthy scent of hay, and the constant awareness of tiny unseen inhabitants would be your nightly companions. If a family had a bit more money, or at least a functional back, they might elevate the straw mattress onto a simple wooden frame. This didn't change the sleep experience dramatically, the fundamental discomfort of straw remained, but it did reduce the chances of waking up with beetles in your ear or a surprise visit from a curious rodent. Linens, as we know them, were a rare treat. Most people slept in the clothes they wore all day, perhaps loosening a belt or unlacing a tunic, but proper pajamas weren't really a thing. And neither was personal space. Whole families, children, parents, maybe a grandparent or two, all slept together in the same cramped space, sometimes on the same straw pile. If you got too warm, you could always roll into your cousin's elbow, or perhaps feel the soft, warm presence of a family pet curled up nearby. The sounds of shared breathing, the occasional snore, the restless shifts of multiple bodies on rustling straw would form the intimate soundtrack of their nights. Nobles, of course, had proper beds. These were grand, imposing pieces of furniture. Large wooden frames, often elaborately carved, with feather mattresses, a true luxury, embroidered sheets, and canopies to keep out the drafts and, hopefully, the lice. These beds were so valuable, so central to a family's status, that they were often passed down in wills. You didn't just inherit land, you inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed, a prized possession that might have seen generations of sleep, dreams, and perhaps a few nightmares. Still, for most medieval folks, a bed wasn't a place of comfort or indulgence. It was a place to not freeze, to avoid the chickens, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of being rich enough to one day sleep on something that didn't squawk or rustle. When we hear nightcap today, we think of a cozy little drink, perhaps something with whiskey, a warm fire, and a questionable decision. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was a hat, a real, tangible, often ridiculous-looking piece of fabric designed to keep your head from freezing off while you slept. You see, insulation wasn't exactly the strong point of medieval architecture. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made of thin animal horn or oiled parchment didn't do much against the biting cold, especially during the long, dark winter nights. And central heating, that was called a dog, or perhaps a family pig, brought inside to share its body warmth. So, to keep their heads warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest through the scalp, medieval people adopted the humble nightcap. These hats came in all shapes and sizes, but the most iconic version was long and pointed, like something you'd expect on a wizard who moonlights as a chimney sweep. They were usually made from wool, linen, or whatever scrap of warmth could be spared without angering the family goat. The coarse texture of the fabric, the way it settled over your ears, muffling the sounds of the night, would be a familiar sensation. For men, it was a practical accessory, a simple necessity against the chill. For women, it sometimes doubled as a coif or head wrap, which also served the dual purpose of maintaining modesty and covering hair that hadn't seen soap since last Lent. The scent of unwashed hair, mixed with the faint smell of smoke and humanity, would cling to the fabric. But beyond warmth, nightcaps had social weight too. In some regions, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, yes, even while asleep. And the cap itself could be embroidered or dyed to reflect a family's wealth or status, because nothing says success like going to bed with a mini flag on your skull. In more urban settings, the nightcap even became a symbol of being off-duty. If you opened your door wearing one, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed for conversation." And yes, this hat does mean go away. Of course, nightcaps were often paired with nightshirts, which were essentially long, loose tunics. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge minus the haunted moral lesson. Sleepwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and occasionally flammable, especially if you got too close to that open hearth. Today, the idea of sleeping next to a stranger is generally limited to red-eye flights, overly ambitious camping trips, or the occasional bizarre Airbnb mix-up. But in medieval Europe, this was completely normal and not at all optional. Let's say you're a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone whose mule gave up halfway to Norwich. You find an inn, a rare luxury in itself, and ask for a place to sleep. What you get is not a room, or a bed, or even a particularly clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected, it was practically unheard of. If the bed had space, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers, who might snore, talk in their sleep, or have a suspicious number of boils. This was not considered rude, it was just efficient use of resources. Beds could host 2, 3, even 4 travelers, depending on size and social tolerance. In larger cities, you might end up in a dormitory-like hall with rows of beds and absolutely zero personal space. Snoring contests were unjudged, elbow territory was fiercely contested, and the symphony of human sounds would fill the cavernous room. Sometimes men and women were separated, but not always. Some inns tried to assign beds by profession, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, allegedly. But often it was first come, first sprawled. And while this might sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes, back then it was an upgrade from sleeping outdoors with the wolves, the rain, and the occasional peasant uprising. The damp chill of the night, the rustling of unseen creatures in the bushes, the looming threat of the unknown outside, the relative safety and warmth of a shared bed, however crowded, was a welcome reprieve. Worried about theft, many travelers slept with their purse tied to their belt or hidden deep under their clothes. Others slept on top of their bundles, turning luggage into both pillow and alarm system. If someone moved your bag, it usually meant you were about to wake up poorer. The rich, of course, did not suffer this fate. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped in relative comfort. Their tents pitched away from the common rabble, or demanded their own rooms if an innkeeper valued their roof and their livelihood. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual operation, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared to potentially die. Hence the enduring popularity of bedtime prayers. Forget lavender spray or calming podcasts. Medieval sleepers wound down with confessions, psalms, and soul-cleansing spiritual clauses, just in case they died somewhere between good night and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die at any moment, from illness, fire, demons, or most dangerously, being over 30 in the year 1247. So you'd better say your prayers, not because it was comforting, but because hell was terrifying, and you didn't want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and spiritually disheveled. One common version, perhaps whispered by a child, was, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Sweet, right? Except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old acknowledging death as a likely bedtime outcome. The stark reality of mortality permeated their daily lives, and especially their nights. Many adults had a whole catalogue of prayers for different threats. One for when you were feeling guilty, one for when you thought the devil might be hiding in the rafters, one for plague prevention, which unfortunately aged poorly. Some even prayed to specific saints known for watching over sleepers, kind of like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club door. The scent of stale incense, perhaps mixed with the lingering smell of wood smoke and damp earth, would fill the small dark room as these whispered pleas were offered. The feel of rough wool against skin, the cold stone floor beneath bare feet, would ground them in the physical world, even as their minds wrestled with spiritual anxieties. The really devout, monks, nuns, and overly anxious nobles, ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before bed. After Compline, they took a vow of silence, which wasn't hard because everyone was already exhausted, underfed, and mildly afraid of the dark. Children were also encouraged to pray, in part because it was good for their souls, and in part because it gave them something to do other than ask why the dog was in their bed again. Parents reminded them that angels were watching, which sounds adorable until you realize it was less guardian angel and more celestial surveillance system, a divine eye always upon them, even in their sleep. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. The weight of potential damnation, the ever-present threat of a sudden, unholy demise, colored their approach to the simplest act of rest. In short, prayer before sleep was less about peace and more about last-minute damage control. Think of it like medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't fully understand how. The weight of potential damnation, the ever-present threat of a sudden, unholy demise, colored their approach to the simplest act of rest. In the modern world, dreams are usually dismissed as random nonsense, stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to file paperwork in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in eternal consequences serious. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were considered messages from God, saints, the devil, your guardian angel, or possibly that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, offering guidance or foretelling future events, while others were demonic temptations designed to lure the innocent soul into sin. Either way, you were supposed to pay attention and possibly write it down, or confess it, or fast for 3 days, just to be safe. The vividness of the images, the emotional weight of the experience, and the lingering sense of unease or inspiration would dictate their actions upon waking. The darkness of the night, the quiet stillness broken only by the sounds of a sleeping household, would make these dream experiences feel even more potent and real. The cool air on one's face, the rough texture of the straw mattress, the scent of unwashed linen. These physical sensations would contrast sharply with the ephemeral, powerful world of their dreams. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries spent an alarming amount of time interpreting dreams. Entire texts were dedicated to decoding them. Dreamt of fire. It might be hell, a warning of damnation. Dreamt of water. It could mean purification or drowning, a symbol of cleansing or peril. Dreamt of a man with a goat's head juggling fish. You'd better call a priest immediately and possibly move. Such a bizarre image surely held a deeper, more sinister meaning. Medieval people believed that what happened in dreams mattered because your soul was still active while you slept. This meant that your actions in a dream could reveal hidden sins or spiritual weaknesses. That mildly embarrassing dream about stealing a loaf of bread, that might be your subconscious confessing your guilt for real-world gluttony or just hunger, but still better to confess it anyway, just in case. The lingering feeling of shame or fear from a dream could haunt them throughout the day, prompting introspection or urgent confession. Monks and nuns often recorded their dreams in detailed spiritual journals and shared them with spiritual superiors. Some were celebrated for having holy visions during sleep, their dreams seen as direct conduits to divine truth. Others were quietly told to eat fewer onions before bed, or perhaps to meditate more diligently, as their dreams seemed less divine and more a product of an unsettled stomach or an overactive imagination. Of course, dreams weren't just spiritual puzzles. They also made excellent plot devices. Medieval literature is full of dream sequences where knights encounter angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures spouting poetry about virtue. Dreams were basically the Netflix of the medieval world, except with more allegory and fewer happy endings. The Church, predictably, was suspicious. Not all dreams were divine, and some were believed to be planted by demons to corrupt the innocent. If you dreamt of something unwholesome, it could mean your soul was under attack, or that you just slept too close to the fireplace fumes again. The subtle scent of sulfur, the faint taste of ash, the feeling of a lingering chill in the air, these might all contribute to a vivid, unsettling dream experience. In modern times, some people let their pets sleep in the bed. It's a cozy, if occasionally smelly, arrangement. In the Middle Ages, however, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was often a heating strategy, born of necessity rather than mere affection. Let's start with the basics. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls, no insulation, drafts so aggressive they probably had names. Central heating? That was called the family pig, or perhaps a cow. In peasant homes, it wasn't unusual for humans and livestock to sleep in the same room, sometimes the same bed, and very often the same pile of straw. Chickens wandered freely, their soft clucking occasionally breaking the silence. Dogs curled up at your feet, their warm fur a comforting presence. Pigs snorted softly beside the hearth, their large bodies radiating a surprising amount of heat. And if you were lucky, none of them bit you during the night. This wasn't about affection, though medieval people certainly appreciated their animals and depended on them for survival. It was about pure, unadulterated survival. Animals generated body heat. They were warm, dependable, and, unlike some relatives, they didn't hog the blanket. A large dog could keep your toes from freezing, its heavy breathing a constant reassuring sound. A cow in the corner might raise the room temperature by a degree or two, which in the depths of January felt like a miracle, a small victory against the biting cold. The faint, earthy smell of straw, mixed with the musky scent of animals, would be an ever-present aroma, a natural part of their living space. Medieval homes, especially those of the lower classes, often had just one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, occasionally dying. Everyone, humans and animals alike, made do with the same space. Children might be nestled between parents and a goat, its soft bleating a familiar sound. A chicken might serve as an impromptu alarm clock, its early morning crow signaling the start of a new day. Hygiene? Let's not ask too many questions. The reality was often far from our modern standards of cleanliness. The faint scratching sounds of various insects, the occasional twitch or snort from a sleeping animal, the sensation of warm fur against bare skin, these were the unremarkable details of their nights. For wealthier families, this wasn't as common. Nobles didn't usually sleep next to livestock, though they might still have lapdogs in bed, not for heat, but for fashion and flea redistribution. The soft murmur of their breathing, the gentle weight of their presence would be a familiar comfort. Some castles even had separate sleeping areas for favourite animals, because nothing says power like a dog with its own room and title, a clear sign of wealth and indulgence. There were drawbacks, of course. Animals can be loud, they can wander, and they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. A hoof in the face at 3 a.m. was just part of the bedtime routine, an unexpected but common interruption. The sudden warmth of a dog shifting its weight against you, the soft breathing of a pig near the hearth, the subtle smells of the farm mixed with the scent of wood smoke. These were the textures and aromas of a medieval night. But medieval people adapted. They understood that these creatures were not just companions, but essential elements of their survival, providing warmth, food, and companionship in a harsh world. If you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence. Monasteries didn't believe in personal space, or softness, or fun, really. The typical dormitory housed dozens of monks, sometimes hundreds, all sleeping in a single large room, usually arranged in neat rows, like morally upright sardines. The vastness of the room, the echoing silence, the faint sounds of multiple breathing bodies would create a unique atmosphere. Beds, if you could call them that, were often just wooden planks, sometimes with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous or it was a feast day. The rough texture of the wood, the rustling of the straw, would be the only sensations of their sleeping surface. You slept fully clothed, not out of modesty alone, but because getting dressed in the dark at 2 a.m. for prize was more painful than just going to bed already prepared. The monastic uniform, including robe, belt, and sandals, doubled as spiritual armor and poor insulation. If you got cold, you layered up with extra wool. If you got hot, well, no, you didn't. There were no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced, not suggested, under the rule of Saint Benedict. If you rolled over and groaned too loudly, you might find yourself on chamber pot duty for a week. Snoring, however, was a grey area. You couldn't control it, but if it became disruptive, the Lord might still hold you accountable, or at least your cellmates would, with a nudge or a quiet, disapproving cough. Lighting was minimal, 1 candle maybe, if that. You didn't need to see, you just needed to lie still and not sin. That was the goal. The faint flickering light would cast long dancing shadows on the stone walls, creating a sense of ancient mystery. The chill in the air, the rough fabric against the skin, the deep quiet broken only by the sounds of the community breathing. These were the sensations of a monastic night. Despite the austerity, monks believed their Spartan beds were training for the afterlife, preparation for the soul's journey by denying the flesh any excess. Sleep was not a pleasure, it was a necessity, monitored and scheduled like everything else, a tool for spiritual discipline. Some monks even slept sitting up, just to avoid any hint of luxury or dreams, or presumably circulation. The discomfort was a deliberate part of their spiritual practice. Compared to this, peasant straw piles and snoring pigs almost seem luxurious. At least the pig didn't judge you or force you to wake up for matins. Let's talk about something that would horrify most modern sleepers. Waking up voluntarily at 2 a.m., and not for a bathroom break or a doom scroll, but for prayer, loud, cold, candle-lit prayer. In medieval monasteries, this was standard practice. Monks and nuns followed a rigid daily schedule based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the first service of the day. And by day, we mean the darkest part of the night, when even the owls were still deciding whether to wake up. The bell would toll, often rung by someone who drew the short straw, its deep, resonant sound echoing through the silent halls and out into the cold, still night. The entire dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived souls would shuffle off to the chapel in silence, their footsteps a soft, rhythmic padding on the stone floors. And yes, still in full clothing, because monks didn't do pajamas. The only layering system they believed in was spiritual. Inside the chapel, by flickering candlelight and under the echo of massive stone vaults, they would chant psalms, recite scriptures, and try their best not to fall asleep on their feet, which incidentally was a real issue. The scent of old stone, damp air, and faint incense would hang heavy in the cool, still air. The only illumination would be the dancing flames of a few candles, casting long, shifting shadows that made the familiar carvings on the walls seem to come alive. There are records of monks being punished for dozing mid-prayer, usually with extra chores or more prayers. You fell asleep in matins? Congratulations, you now get to lead the next one. The feeling of extreme fatigue, the involuntary drooping of eyelids, the sudden jolt of waking up as your head nodded, These would be familiar sensations. Matins could last an hour or more. Some particularly enthusiastic orders stretched it to 2. Imagine trying to stay spiritually engaged while your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down. The rumble of a hungry stomach, the faint chill seeping into tired bones, the effort required to keep the mind focused on the sacred texts, it was a true test of endurance. After the service, monks would either return to bed for their second sleep, their bodies heavy with fatigue, or, in stricter orders, move straight into study or manual labor, because nothing says holy discipline like threshing wheat on 4 hours of fragmented rest. The rough texture of grain in their hands, the rhythmic sound of the flail, the faint scent of straw and dust, these would fill the early morning hours. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and dedicate the first and quietest part of the night to God, uninterrupted by the temptations of daylight, warmth, or REM cycles. It was a powerful symbol of devotion, or at least it was once you got over the numb feet, the candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. The cold, damp air, the rough wool of their habits, the quiet sounds of their communal efforts, these were the hallmarks of their ascetic existence. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often framed as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just an ability to control the blanket. In the medieval world, though, sleeping alone was considered suspicious, impractical, or just downright unsafe. Let's start with the basics. Warmth. Beds, as we've established, weren't exactly toasty. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't do much to trap heat, and central heating was still several plagues away. So people shared beds for body heat, not out of intimacy, but out of basic thermal desperation. Children slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes the neighbor's kid if they were visiting. It was like a sleepover, but nobody asked if you wanted to be there. The comforting weight of multiple bodies under shared blankets, the warmth radiating from each person, was a practical necessity. The sounds of shared breathing, the occasional snore, the restless shifts of bodies seeking comfort, these would be the common nighttime soundtrack. But beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for sleeping in groups. Many people believed the night was when the devil worked overtime. Alone in the dark, your soul might be vulnerable to temptation, or worse, possession. Having others nearby created a kind of moral buffer zone. If something went wrong, at least someone would witness it or catch the demon first. The faint light of a shared lamp, the constant awareness of other human presences, would offer a small sense of security against the unknown terrors of the night. For children, being alone at night was practically unthinkable, not just for comfort, but because ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were all part of the nightly landscape. Tales warned against solitary sleep as a gateway to mischief and spiritual peril. And unlike today's bedtime stories, these tales didn't end in hugs. They ended in disappearances, or worse. The rustling of branches outside, the creak of old timbers, the distant hoot of an owl, these natural sounds could easily be interpreted as the approach of something sinister. Even married couples often shared their beds with children, servants, or random guests. Privacy was not a concept so much as a modern myth. In fact, the idea of 2 people sleeping alone in a giant bed would have been considered either wasteful or deeply, deeply suspicious. In religious contexts, even monks often slept communally, and if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was often for disciplinary reasons. Yes, in some cases, being alone in bed was literally a punishment. Medieval logic was clear. Solitary sleep grants opportunity for sin. Group sleep ensures public accountability. The feeling of rough wool against your skin, the cool air on your face, the muffled sounds of other sleeping bodies, the faint scent of wood smoke and humanity, these sensations would accompany their collective rest. Next time you're curled up in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like goat, enjoy the silence. In medieval times, you'd probably have 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin in there with you, all of them snoring. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident, it was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense. If you've ever accidentally fallen asleep sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or a dentist's waiting room, you probably woke up with a crick in your neck and a deep sense of regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping upright wasn't an accident, it was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, particularly the wealthy or religiously devout, chose to sleep propped up rather than lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none of them particularly restful. First, there was a medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the general balance of the bodily humors. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this logic made perfect sense.
Upright sleeping, they believed, helped avoid congestion of the brain, which sounds ominous, but mostly meant don't drown in your own phlegm. The sensation of leaning against a hard, unyielding surface, the slight ache in the lower back, the pressure on the tailbone, these discomforts were accepted as part of the process. The rhythmic sounds of their own breathing, the subtle shifting of their weight, would be the backdrop to their upright slumber. Second, there were spiritual concerns. Lying flat was considered too close to the posture of the dead. You didn't want to confuse God, or worse, attract attention from the angel of death by sleeping in the same position used at funerals. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubled as the community's health consultant, you picked your battles carefully. As a result, people often slept partially reclined, supported by large bolsters, pillows, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy-boy. Nobles sometimes had their beds rigged with angled supports to maintain a semi-seated posture, perfect for digesting one's evening meat pie or fending off surprise demon attacks. The soft rustle of feather-filled pillows, the sturdy feel of the wooden frame, the scent of expensive linen, these were the sensory details of a noble's upright sleep. Monks took it a step further. In stricter orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall, with nothing but a hood to muffle the discomfort. It wasn't about health, it was about discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. If you sinned, well, welcome to confession at 5 a.m. Needless to say, this wasn't about quality rest, it was about virtue, discomfort, and mildly confusing theology. The cold, unyielding stone, the rough texture of their habit, the deep, silent chill in the air, these were the sensations that accompanied their ascetic sleep. The faint scent of old stone, dampness, and human presence would be ever present. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval people, the real unseen disturbances of the night were already in the sheets. Small, persistent, and entirely uninterested in your prayers.
We're talking, of course, about fleas, lice, and the medieval bedroom's unofficial mascot, the bedbug. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap was sometimes made from substances better left unnamed. Add that to straw-filled mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect environment for a persistent pest presence. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically roommates. Peasants dealt with daily discomfort from these pervasive insects. Unpleasant sensations and constant low-level irritation would be a familiar part of their nightly experience. The faint, earthy smell of the straw would mingle with the distinct, musky scent of unwashed bodies and unbathed animals. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, were not exempt. In fact, some richer households had dedicated nitpickers, actual servants tasked with removing lice from their employers' hair and clothing. Imagine that as your job title, Master of the Royal Scalp. The gentle tug on the hair, the soft scraping sound of a comb, the feeling of tiny creatures being removed. These were the intimate, if unpleasant, details of their personal grooming. Bedbugs, meanwhile, were the silent disruptors of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even the cracks in stone walls, emerging at night to feed. The appearance of small, irritating marks on the skin and a general sense of being subtly disturbed would characterize their nightly torment. If you ever wondered why medieval people wore nightcaps and slept fully clothed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was pest defense armor. The thick fabric, the tight fit of a cap might offer some meager protection against the incessant biting. Solutions ranged from mildly effective to impressively deranged. Some households burned strong-smelling herbs like wormwood or tansy to repel bugs, the pungent, acrid smoke filling the small enclosed spaces. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes in the bed, which may have done little for the pests, but certainly kept romance to a minimum. The sharp, sulphuric scent of garlic, the dry, gritty feel of ash, these unusual additions to their sleeping environment would be a testament to their desperation. It wasn't just physical discomfort either. Fleas were often seen as symbols of sin or moral impurity, biting reminders of the fall of man and poor bedding choices. Entire poems were written about fleas, some moralizing, some weirdly romantic, because nothing says "I love you" like "let us be united like the flea that bites us both." So while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something was crawling on your shin, because it was. The constant low hum of unseen life, the intermittent sharp pains of bites, the persistent itching, these were the true nightmares of the medieval night. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. Now, to be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was hot, heavy, and loud. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery, every movement accompanied by a clinking, metallic symphony. The rough, cold feel of metal against skin, the pressure of heavy plates on the body, the stifling warmth that quickly turned to dampness, these sensations would make true rest impossible. But during wartime or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer choice. Comfort, optional. Survival, highly recommended. A knight on campaign might remove only his helmet and gauntlets, keeping his mail shirt or breastplate on just in case enemies decided to stage a midnight surprise party. There's nothing quite like waking up to the sound of hooves and having to suit up while still half dreaming about turnips. The metallic scent of the armor, the dull ache in the shoulders and back, the constant awareness of the weight, these were the prices of vigilance. In castles under siege, men-at-arms might even sleep with swords or axes at their side, like some very aggressive bedtime security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows, offering a hard, unyielding surface for a weary head. And if the enemy breached the walls, well, at least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities. The cold, metallic taste of fear, the dull gleam of polished steel in the faint candlelight, the rough texture of a shield against the cheek, these were the companions of a soldier's uneasy slumber. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Iron isn't breathable, and chainmail has a bad habit of pinching skin, causing persistent, irritating discomfort. Add cold stone floors, minimal bedding, and the ambient sounds of snoring comrades and crackling torches, and you've got a sleep environment that ranks somewhere below airport terminal on the comfort scale. Even those not in battle sometimes wore light protective gear while sleeping in dangerous regions. Traveling merchants or guards on watch duty might nap in gambesons, thick quilted jackets that offered a bit of protection and slightly more padding than the moral support of prayer alone. The rough, padded fabric, the slight rustle of the quilting, the comforting warmth it provided against the chill, these were the small mercies of a guarded sleep. And lest we forget, armor wasn't exactly subtle. If you rolled over the wrong way, you might clank so loudly that everyone else woke up and assumed the apocalypse had arrived again. The sharp, sudden clang of metal on metal, the immediate silence that followed as everyone held their breath, waiting, these were the moments of accidental disruption. In a time when nightly demons, lice infestations, and pigs in your bed weren't considered unusual, you might think that sleepwalking was just one more medieval inconvenience. But oh no, it was much more dramatic than that. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. The faint shuffle of bare feet on a cold floor, the soft rustle of a nightshirt, the eerie silence of a figure moving without conscious intent, these would be unsettling sights. Sleepwalking, or noctambulation if you wanted to impress the local monk, was poorly understood and often feared. The idea that someone could rise from their straw pallet, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall was less harmless parasomnia and more devil's rehearsal dinner. Accounts from the time suggest that people were genuinely spooked by sleepwalkers. Picture this: a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You'd think ghost, or heretic, or both. And depending on your local priest, an exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast.
The chilling sense of unreality, the feeling that something profoundly wrong was happening, would fill the observers with dread. The flickering light of the candle, casting dancing shadows, would only add to the macabre scene. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad humors, especially too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't explain. Others thought it happened because the soul was temporarily released during sleep, leaving the body free to bumble around like an unattended mule.
To prevent these nightly adventures, people tried everything from herbal remedies to praying over their beds, hanging iron charms, or, in more rural areas, just tying the person's leg to a chair. If that sounds extreme, consider that some medieval homes had open hearths, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting to be tragically overturned. The cold, hard feel of iron, the rough texture of a rope, the faint scent of herbs, these were the methods employed to keep the wandering soul contained. In one curious twist, there were rumors of people climbing onto rooftops in their sleep. Whether or not these accounts were exaggerated, the fear of leaping dreamers led to barred windows and occasional theological debates about whether a person could sin while unconscious. The chill of the night air, the dizzying height, the precariousness of their position, these would heighten the drama of such an incident. Thankfully, most sleepwalkers just paced, muttered, or attempted to open imaginary doors. But if someone sleepwalked into a church, locals might treat it as a divine sign or call for a cleansing ritual, just to cover all spiritual bases. The echo of their footsteps in the sacred space, the low murmur of incomprehensible words, the chilling sense of the uncanny, these would make the experience truly unforgettable for those who witnessed it. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos.
Church bells, thunderstorms, screaming livestock, the occasional siege. For the sleep-deprived denizens of the Middle Ages, these were just ambient noises, the medieval version of white noise. The resonant, deep toll of a church bell, cutting through the stillness of the night, would mark the hours, becoming a familiar, almost comforting rhythm. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day: sunrise, prayer times, meals, and of course the ungodly hour of matins at 2 or 3 a.m. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably soundtracked by regular tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. The vibrating sensation in the air, the deep, pervasive sound, would seep into their subconscious. And it wasn't just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. With no weather apps or triple-glazed windows, you experienced every clap of thunder like the world might end. Roofs leaked, sending cold drips onto sleeping faces. Windows rattled violently in their frames, and chimneys howled like banshees, a mournful, eerie sound in the darkness. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't stop for insomnia, neither did ploughing, praying, or running from Vikings. The sharp, metallic scent of rain, the dampness in the air, the chill seeping into the stone walls, these were the physical sensations of a stormy night. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always a deal-breaker for bedtime either. In the 14th century, people continued to sleep somehow through famine, war, and even the Black Death. When death carts rolled by in the morning, their creaking wheels and the somber calls of the drivers would be a grim wake-up call, considered more of a regular occurrence than a cause for panic. And if you didn't wake up, well, some believed that was a mercy.
The pervasive sweet scent of decay, the quiet weeping of mourners, the chilling silence of absence, these would become a part of the everyday soundscape. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, the ground shaking beneath them, barn fires, the smell of smoke and the crackle of flames filling the air, and angry mobs, their shouts and curses echoing in the night. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adjusted. If you worked from sun-up to sundown, ate barely enough to survive, and spent your day dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual damnation, you were going to fall asleep hard and fast. The sheer physical exhaustion, the dull ache in every muscle, the gnawing hunger, these would drive them into a deep, heavy slumber, a brief respite from the relentless hardships of life. And then there were those who used sleep as a kind of escape hatch. Faced with illness, grief, or fear of the world literally ending, which was forecast roughly every century, some people just curled up under a cloak, mumbled a prayer, and took a nap. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that, a quiet resignation to forces beyond their control. The soft, comforting weight of a rough wool cloak, the faint scent of lanolin and human presence, the feeling of letting go of the world, even for a few hours, these were the sensations of their escape. The chill of the air, the sounds of the world continuing around them, would fade into a muffled background, allowing them a temporary reprieve. Chapter 2. The Whispers of Fear in Salem. In the winter of 1692, the village of Salem, Massachusetts, was cloaked in more than just snow. It was cloaked in tension, suspicion, and a quiet kind of fear that seeped into the timber-framed homes and frozen fields. The air itself seemed heavy with unspoken anxieties, the crisp bite of the winter wind carrying not just cold, but a pervasive sense of dread. You could almost feel the weight of communal apprehension, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The people of Salem were Puritans, strict, devout, and deeply superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill, watched by God and constantly stalked by Satan, a dark, malevolent presence lurking just beyond the edge of their well-ordered lives. The dense, dark woods surrounding the settlement, with their ancient, gnarled trees, seemed to whisper of unseen dangers, of ancient evils that predated their arrival. Life was already hard. The village had recently split from Salem town over politics and religion, creating deep rifts and resentments among neighbors, a silent war of whispers and cold shoulders. Crops had failed in recent seasons, leaving bellies empty and spirits low, the taste of hunger a bitter, familiar companion. Smallpox had ravaged nearby communities, leaving a trail of death and sorrow, the constant fear of disease, a low thrum beneath the surface of daily life. Wars with native tribes had left many traumatized, haunted by the screams of battle and the sight of smoke rising from burning homes. There was friction between neighbors, inheritance disputes, and a deep simmering resentment toward outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit in. The narrow, muddy pathways between homes, usually bustling with activity, now felt quieter, more guarded, as people walked with their eyes downcast, avoiding direct gaze. Add to this the long, dark, bitter New England winter, a season of isolation and scarcity, and something was bound to break. The cold, unyielding ground beneath their feet, the gray, uninviting sky, the relentless, biting wind, these external hardships mirrored the internal turmoil of the community. That break came in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave strangely. They screamed uncontrollably, their voices sharp and piercing, echoing through the small house. They threw things, small objects clattering against the wooden walls, seemingly propelled by an unseen force. They contorted their bodies in unnatural ways, their limbs twisting and jerking as if seized by an invisible hand.
At times they fell silent for hours, their eyes wide with terror, staring at something only they could see, their faces pale and drawn. The air in the Paris home would grow thick with a sense of unease, the sound of the girls' cries followed by an eerie, profound silence. Neighbors whispered that they were cursed, their hushed tones carrying on the cold winter air. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces, complaining of sharp, unseen pains, of the phantom pressure of fingers on their skin. The feeling of helplessness, of witnessing something profoundly disturbing, would settle heavily on those around them. Reverend Paris, unsure of what to do, his face etched with worry, called in a local doctor, William Griggs. After failing to find any physical cause for the girl's alarming symptoms, Griggs delivered the diagnosis that would plunge the village into chaos: witchcraft. That single word, spoken in the hushed confines of a small cold room, set fire to the fears already simmering in Salem. The taste of fear, sharp and acrid, would fill the mouths of those who heard it. In a place where witches were believed to be real, dangerous servants of the devil, the idea was not far-fetched. It was terrifyingly plausible. The very air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a dark current flowing beneath the surface. And now, if the devil could worm his way into the minister's own household, a bastion of piety, what did that mean for the rest of the community? The sound of their own heartbeats, thumping nervously in their chests, would be a constant reminder of the encroaching dread.
The girls, prodded by both adults and peers, their voices now imbued with a strange, chilling authority, began naming names. First, they accused women on the margins, social misfits and outcasts, those already viewed with suspicion or disdain. But soon the accusations would reach the respectable, the wealthy, even the pious, pulling the entire community into a spiraling vortex of paranoia. Salem was a small village, its narrow lanes and modest homes a seemingly peaceful tableau. But what was about to happen would echo far beyond its borders. The faint scent of wood smoke from their chimneys, usually a comforting aroma, now seemed to carry a hint of something darker, something burning. What began as whispers in the dark, hushed and terrified, would soon become cries from the gallows, loud and unyielding, and a legacy of paranoia that still haunts America's history books, a chilling reminder of the fragility of reason in the face of fear. Once the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling everything it touched. The afflicted girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, seemed to grow bolder with each passing day, their performances more dramatic, their voices more shrill. They convulsed in court, their bodies jerking violently, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. They screamed during prayers, their piercing cries cutting through the reverent silence of the meeting house, disrupting the sacred ritual. They claimed they could see dark spirits hovering over certain villagers, pointing trembling fingers at unsuspecting individuals, their eyes wide with feigned or real terror. It wasn't just childhood imagination, it was theatrical, public, and most disturbingly, it was believed. The taste of dust in the air, the dry, rasping sound of their strained voices, the sight of their twisting forms, these details amplified the terror.
The first to be accused were those with the least protection, women who already lived on the edges of society, their lives already precarious. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, was known for muttering to herself when turned away from doorsteps,
her voice a low, guttural murmur. People claimed her mumbling was a curse, a dark incantation. She smoked a pipe, the acrid scent of tobacco clinging to her threadbare clothes. She snapped at children, her patience worn thin by hardship and hunger. She fit the mold of a witch because she didn't fit the mold of a Puritan woman, her rough, unkempt appearance contrasting sharply with the prim, severe attire of the other villagers. The rough texture of her tattered garments, the faint, earthy smell of the outdoors clinging to her, all served to alienate her further. Sarah Osborne hadn't attended church in over a year, and had scandalized the community by marrying her indentured servant after her first husband died. A woman who defied convention, clearly suspect in the eyes of a rigid community. The quiet hum of gossip, the pointed stares, the cold shoulders she received. These were the subtle punishments for her defiance. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household, was the most exotic of all, originating from Barbados. Her storytelling, her distinct accent, and her knowledge of folklore frightened the villagers, stirring up ancient fears of magic and the unknown. The rich, earthy smell of Caribbean spices, the melodic cadence of her voice, so different from their own, would have seemed mysterious and potentially dangerous. Under pressure, possibly even physical beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft. But instead of clearing the air, her confession blew it wide open. She told a story of a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs, their forms flickering at the edge of perception. But most damning of all, she claimed there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. Once Tituba opened the door, others rushed through it. New names were added weekly, pulled from the fear-choked air or from the festering grudges of neighbors. Neighbors turned on neighbors, old grudges were disguised as righteous accusations, and property disputes turned into spectral assaults. If someone's cow died suddenly, its bloated, silent form a grim sight, it must have been witchcraft. If a baby cried uncontrollably during a prayer, its piercing wails filling the meeting house, surely that was the devil's doing. The fear became so infectious that not even the innocent dared to speak out. To defend an accused witch was to invite suspicion upon yourself. Silence was safety, a heavy cloak draped over their fears. And so the web of accusations widened, trapping the village in its sticky, unseen threads. The taste of fear was now a constant in the air, metallic and sharp. Logic was fading, replaced by the rising tide of hysteria, a collective madness that swelled with each new accusation. Hysteria was now in control, a palpable, vibrating presence in every room, every conversation, every silent gaze. Chapter 3: The Gavel's Echo and the Hill of Sorrows. As accusations mounted and the village reached a fever pitch, the colonial government, distant and slow to react, finally stepped in. Governor William Phips, recently appointed and eager to maintain order in his new dominion, established a special court to deal with the chaos. It was called the Court of Oya and Termina, from the French meaning to hear and determine. But what it really became was a factory for fear-driven justice, a relentless engine grinding out accusations and convictions. The somber echo of the judge's gavel, a sharp final sound, would punctuate the proceedings. The court convened in Salem town in June of 1692, and it was no ordinary tribunal. Its rules were warped by panic, bending under the immense pressure of public terror. Instead of requiring hard evidence or reliable witnesses, it allowed something far more dangerous: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence was testimony that a spirit or spectre of the accused had afflicted the victim. In other words, if a person claimed to have seen your ghost-like form in a dream choking them, that was admissible in court. Never mind that the accused could be asleep, at church, or miles away, it was their spirit doing the devil's work. You couldn't cross-examine a dream, and worse, you couldn't disprove it. The chilling detail of a phantom pinch, the feeling of invisible hands on the throat, the sight of spectral forms, these were taken as irrefutable proof. The dry, dusty air of the courtroom, the hushed whispers of the onlookers, the oppressive weight of judgment, would make the atmosphere heavy and tense. Children were now treated as star witnesses, their seizures, screams, and gasps in court becoming more theatrical by the day, seemingly cued by the presence of the accused. One girl, Mary Walcott, would fall into fits the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she shrieked. If they didn't look at her, she shrieked louder. The performances were mesmerizing, horrifying, and utterly convincing to those gripped by fear. And the judges, including the influential Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, accepted it all without question. The sharp, piercing sound of their screams, the convulsive movements of their bodies, the feeling of cold dread spreading through the room, these details solidified the belief in witchcraft. Defense lawyers? There were none. The concept didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you stood alone, facing the wrath of the court and the hysteria of the crowd. If you denied the charges, the afflicted girls writhed in agony, their pain seemingly proof of your guilt. If you confessed, you might be spared death, but only if you named others, implicating more innocent people. The system rewarded lies and punished silence, twisting truth into a grotesque parody of justice. The taste of despair, metallic and bitter, would fill the mouths of the accused. Worse still, the trials became public spectacles. People traveled from nearby towns to witness them, filling the small courtroom to overflowing, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous fear. The accused were paraded into court in shackles, their chains clanking softly, often bewildered, often poor, and almost always powerless. The cold, unyielding feel of the iron on their wrists, the rough texture of their prison clothes, the stares of the judgmental crowd, these were the indignities they faced. And yet not everyone believed. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking, their voices low and hushed, fearful of being overheard. Others questioned why only certain types of people were being accused, why the accusations seemed to target the vulnerable or the inconvenient. But few spoke openly. Questioning the court meant questioning the will of God in Salem, an act of supreme heresy. Silence was safety, a heavy, suffocating blanket that stifled dissent. And so, in Salem, reason had stepped aside, yielding to the chaotic grip of panic, and the law had become a mirror reflecting fear, not justice. On June 10, 1692, the gallows in Salem claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was not new to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy target, a woman already viewed with suspicion. She wore bright red clothing, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier. Her defiant spirit, her refusal to conform to Puritan norms, marked her for destruction.
During her trial, neighbors testified that her spirit pinched them in the night, a sharp, unseen pain. That their babies died after she passed by, their small, lifeless forms a grim accusation. And that she kept enchanted dolls, physical objects believed to contain dark magic. She denied everything, her voice firm, but it didn't matter.
The court, swayed by the spectral evidence and the fervent cries of the afflicted, found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a barren, wind-swept patch of earth just outside Salem, its desolate landscape mirroring the cold, empty feeling in her heart. The rough, splintery feel of the cart, the jingle of the chains, the distant murmur of the crowd, these would be her final earthly sensations. No prayer, no mercy. The rope was pulled, the crowd watched, their faces grim. And with that single execution, the machinery of death began to churn, relentless and unforgiving. The chilling sound of the rope tightening, the quiet gasp of the crowd, the final dreadful silence, these sounds marked the beginning of Salem's dark chapter. The hangings that followed came quickly, a terrifying procession of death. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some had good standing in the church. Rebecca Nurse in particular was a shocking case, an elderly, pious woman, beloved in the community, her life a testament to devout faith. Even the jury initially found her not guilty, a flicker of reason amidst the madness. But under immense pressure from the court and the relentless theatrical fits of the afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. Nurse's final words were whispered through the air like a warning, her voice thin but clear. "I am as innocent as the child unborn." But it didn't matter. The noose did not discriminate. It choked the innocent as readily as the condemned. The chilling sound of the rope tightening, the quiet gasp of the crowd, the final dreadful silence, these sounds marked the beginning of Salem's dark chapter.
The field of the rough rope, the final constriction, the fading light, these were the last sensations of the condemned. In August, more executions followed, each one tightening the knot of fear around the village. On September 22nd, the deadliest day, 8 people were hanged in a single morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman who had doubted the trials early on, daring to question the authority of the court, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a different, more horrific fate. Giles refused to enter a plea, his silence an act of defiance against a system he deemed unjust. The court, unable to proceed with a trial without one, resorted to an ancient English punishment. Pain fort et dure. He was pressed to death. Stones were piled on his chest, slowly, cruelly, over 3 days, each stone adding to the agonizing pressure. His final words, as legend has it, were "more weight," a chilling testament to his unwavering resolve. The immense crushing weight, the slow agony of suffocation, the cold, unyielding stone against his skin, these were the torments of his final hours. By the end of the hysteria, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 more died in jail awaiting trial, their bodies wasting away in the cold, damp cells. Dozens confessed falsely to save their lives, their lies a desperate bargain with death. Over 200 people were accused, their names dragged through the mud of suspicion and fear. The gallows cast long shadows over Salem, not just on the hill where the condemned met their end, but in every heart, every home. Fear had become law, and justice, blindfolded, had been led to the scaffold, a puppet of panic. The bitter taste of injustice, sharp and acrid, lingered in the air. The faint, metallic scent of iron shackles, the pervasive smell of damp earth and fear, would be the lasting memory of those dark days. Chapter 4: The Unraveling and the Lingering Shame. While the executions claimed the spotlight and seized the public's terrified attention, hundreds of others sat in cramped, foul-smelling jails waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's small jail couldn't contain them all. Accused witches were held in neighboring towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starving, freezing, and largely forgotten by a world consumed by fear. The constant jingle of chains, the cold, unyielding stone beneath their bodies, the pervasive stench of human waste and disease, these were the sensory torments of their imprisonment. You could almost taste the stale, damp air, thick with despair. Most of the accused weren't witches or even outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, children, people whose only crime was having a quarrel with the wrong person or owning land someone else wanted. In many cases, personal grudges disguised as divine justice drove the accusations. A pig wandered into a neighbor's yard and died. Must be witchcraft. The putrid smell of the decaying animal would serve as a morbid proof. Someone refused to help with firewood. Clearly they'd cursed the axe. The rough, splintery feel of the unchopped wood, the chill of the unheated home would fuel the resentment. Mary Easty, sister of the executed Rebecca Nurse, was one such case. She was a respected mother of 7, known for her piety, her life seemingly beyond reproach. Initially released by the court due to a lack of convincing evidence, she was rearrested days later after new fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In a final desperate petition to the judges, Mary begged them not for her own life, but that they put a stop to these proceedings before more innocent blood is shed. Her voice, though unheard, carried the weight of profound despair. She was hanged soon after, another innocent life extinguished on the hill of sorrows. The faint, earthy smell of the gallows, the feeling of the rough rope, these sensations marked her final moments. Another notable case was Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, a testament to the depths of the hysteria. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated, a terrifying ordeal for a small child, and under pressure she confessed to being a witch. Her answers, gibberish and fear-laced, were taken as truth, twisted into damning evidence. She was imprisoned for 8 months in chains, the cold, heavy metal chafing her tiny wrists. When finally released, she was mentally broken, never fully recovering from the trauma. The constant clinking of the chains, the cold, damp air of the cell, the terrifying faces of her accusers, these horrors would forever be etched in her memory. Pregnant women were not spared. Elizabeth Proctor, whose husband John Proctor would later hang, was found guilty and sentenced to die. But because she was pregnant, her execution was delayed. It likely saved her life. She gave birth in jail, the cries of her newborn echoing in the grim confines, and was eventually released after the trials ended, a survivor in a land of the condemned. The sounds of her labor, the fragile cries of the infant, the cold, hard feel of the prison floor, these experiences underscored the inhumanity of the proceedings. Accusations snowballed. Some accused confessed in desperation to avoid death, then named others to shift suspicion away from themselves, creating an ever-expanding web of lies and betrayals. Entire families were pulled into the spiral. Fathers, wives, daughters, no one was beyond reach. Meanwhile, the jails swelled beyond capacity. Food was scarce, disease spread, and many died awaiting trial, lost in the legal limbo of paranoia. And still new names were added each week. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who was willing to say your name.
The faint scent of sickness, the constant low murmur of suffering, the feeling of cold, brittle hope. These were the grim realities of the overflowing jails. By the fall of 1692, the spell of hysteria began to crack, not because the court came to its senses, but because reality, stark and undeniable, forced its way back in. The turning point came when accusations grew too bold, too indiscriminate, crossing lines that even a fear-addled society couldn't ignore. People who had once supported the trials found themselves suddenly on the wrong side of them. Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister, was arrested and charged with being the ringleader of the witches. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and had previously clashed with influential families in the village. That was enough. The murmur of disapproval, the subtle shifts in allegiances, would begin to ripple through the community. But on the day of his execution, Burroughs did something shocking. He stood on the gallows, his voice clear and resonant, and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed incapable of doing. The crowd fell silent, a collective gasp echoing on the wind-swept hill. Some wept, tears streaming down their faces. Even hardened observers were shaken, a seed of doubt finally beginning to sprout in their terror-stricken minds. But the execution went on, the grim machinery of justice unable to stop its rotation. The chilling sound of the rope, the final dreadful silence, would forever be linked to that profound moment of doubt. That moment planted a seed of doubt, a tiny crack in the edifice of fear. Then came the accusation of Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps. Suddenly, the hysteria had reached the top of the colony's social ladder. Phipps, already unnerved by growing criticism and chaos, finally took action. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Termina, halting all pending executions and trials. The sound of his decree, though distant, would be like a sudden rush of fresh air. Public sentiment had shifted. Ministers, once silent or complicit, began to speak out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, denounced the use of spectral evidence. It were better, he said, that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person should be condemned. A radical thought in a society that had for months believed exactly the opposite. People who had once cheered the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the appetite for more blood had dulled. Too many respected figures were being accused. Too many innocent people had been buried. The villagers had begun to see that this wasn't divine justice. It was madness, a terrifying, self-perpetuating cycle of fear and accusation. Confessions dried up. Some accusers backtracked, their previous certainty replaced by a quiet shame. Others disappeared from public view, their names whispered in hushed tones. And those who had previously shouted the loudest now lowered their eyes, unable to meet the gaze of their neighbors. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had exhausted itself. The public wanted stability. The officials wanted to save face. And Salem, bruised and ashamed, was finally ready to wake from its nightmare. The storm was breaking, but the damage had already been done, the scars etched deep into the community's soul. By late 1692, the judicial system that had fueled the hysteria began to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. With the court of Oya and Termina disbanded in October, a new, more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was formed in early 1693. This time things were different. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed, a crucial shift that crippled the accuser's power. The judges were noticeably more skeptical of the accuser's wild claims, their faces displaying quiet disbelief rather than fervent conviction.
The solemn sound of their deliberations, the measured tone of their questions, replaced the previous chaos. The result? The convictions slowed dramatically. Many accused witches were acquitted outright, their freedom a sudden, almost unbelievable gift. Of the 56 cases brought before the new court, the majority were released, their chains removed with a soft clink, their steps faltering as they walked out into the cold light of day. Even those who had already confessed began to recant their testimonies, admitting that fear, torture, or immense pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic performances of the afflicted girls lost their persuasive power, their screams now sounding shrill and unconvincing. The most prominent case in the unraveling of the trials was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who came under suspicion. While he was never formally charged, the fact that such a high-ranking, devout man could be suspected highlighted how arbitrary and corrupt the process had become. The very air in the courtroom, once thick with fear, now seemed to clear, a tangible easing of tension. The court, once ferocious, was now cautious. They began quietly releasing those still in jail, first those with little evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed to witchcraft under duress, their liberation a quiet, almost ashamed process. Meanwhile, families of the executed began to demand justice. John Proctor's children petitioned for the return of his property, their voices filled with righteous anger. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a tireless campaign to clear her name, their determination a beacon of hope in the darkness. In time, community shame replaced community fear. Church congregations fractured, their unity shattered. Friendships were severed, relationships irrevocably broken. The very fabric of Salem's social order had been shredded, leaving behind a raw, painful wound. Governor Phipps, realizing the colony's growing international embarrassment and the deep internal divisions, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But even freedom came at a cost. Many families had to pay for their own jail fees before being released. Imagine losing your home, your health, and nearly your life, only to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. The bitter taste of this final indignity lingered. By the end of the ordeal, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 had been accused. The court didn't just collapse, it imploded, leaving behind a crater, grief, and disbelief. The trials had ended, but the healing had not even begun. Salem was a village forever altered by the people it had lost, the justice it had abandoned, and the chilling mirror it was now forced to look into. The gallows were silent, the jails had emptied, but Salem was far from peaceful. The ghost of fear, not of witches, would haunt its quiet lanes for generations. Chapter 5. Fulvia, a force unseen no more. Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite yet slightly eccentric Fulvi family. It was an old plebeian house that had long since clawed its way into the upper echelons of Roman politics, gaining influence and wealth through generations of shrewd maneuvering.
Though not one of the oldest patrician plans, the Fulvia had produced consuls, generals, and celebrated orators. Their bloodline carried both fierce ambition and a taste for disruption, a willingness to challenge the established order. The very air within their grand Roman home would have buzzed with political intrigue and strategic discussions, a constant hum of power. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was known more for his bumbling speech than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, literally referred to his stammer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. She was born to command, her voice clear and resonant, her will unyielding. From a young age, Fulvia would have been surrounded by the sharp-edged, ruthless world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy in her home, their voices rising and falling in passionate arguments. Elections and treachery were daily news, reported with hushed tones or fervent shouts. She would have seen how politics wasn't just played in the forum, in grand speeches and public debates, but in marriages carefully arranged for strategic alliances, in funerals transformed into platforms for political grandstanding, in whispered rumors that could destroy reputations, and in shadowy backroom deals sealed with a handshake. The scent of expensive perfumes, of old parchment, and the faint metallic tang of ambition would have filled the air. Women in elite Roman households were generally expected to be quiet partners, refined, educated in the domestic arts, and obedient, their influence exerted subtly through their husbands and sons. Fulvia would break all of those expectations, shattering the mold of the compliant Roman matron. She was wealthy, highly educated, and incredibly well connected, and she knew it, keenly aware of the power she possessed through her lineage and her own formidable intellect. While her early life remains hazy in the historical record, a period of quiet observation and learning, her later actions suggest a young woman who was intensely observant, politically literate, and utterly unafraid to assert herself. This wasn't someone who faded into the background, content to pull strings from the shadows. She had a strong personality, a sharp political mind, capable of dissecting complex situations with piercing clarity, and an unyielding will to act, even in the traditionally male-dominated space of Roman governance. The cool touch of marble beneath her fingers, the weighty feel of a scroll in her hands, the distant sounds of the bustling city, these details would form the backdrop of her formative years. This was also a period of unprecedented instability. The Republic was unraveling, tearing at its seams. Civil wars, populist revolts, and brutal power struggles between titanic generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar were turning Rome into a pressure cooker, a cauldron of ambition and violence. The old rules were collapsing, giving way to a new, unpredictable order, and Fulvia came of age right in the middle of it. The taste of dust, the distant cries of the populace, the palpable tension in the air, these were the sensations of her tumultuous era. Rather than recoil from chaos as many might, Fulvia would learn to use it, to harness its unpredictable energy for her own political ends. Her early life didn't produce the kind of modest matron Rome idealized. It produced a woman who saw politics not as a man's world to be feared and avoided, but as a battlefield to be mastered, a strategic game to be played with cunning and boldness. She would go on to marry 3 powerful men, each one a radical player in Roman history, men who shaped the very destiny of the Republic. But Fulvia wouldn't just marry power. She would command armies, lead revolts, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coinage, not as a goddess or a symbolic figure, but as herself, Fulvia, a political force in her own right. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome, poised to leave an indelible mark on its volatile landscape. The sound of her own steady breathing, the firm set of her jaw, the determined glint in her eyes, these were the hallmarks of a woman on the cusp of shattering tradition. Fulvia's first marriage was to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no ordinary Roman noble. He was a populist agitator, a political arsonist with a flair for chaos, scandal, and street-level power. He understood the raw, visceral energy of the Roman mob, how to incite them, how to harness their grievances. To many of the Roman elite, with their rigid traditions and disdain for the common people, he was dangerous, a volatile force threatening their established order. To the masses, however, he was a hero, a champion of their rights, a voice for their frustrations. And to Fulvia, he was a strategic opportunity, a powerful conduit to the turbulent undercurrents of Roman society. Their marriage, sometime in the early 50s BCE, united Fulvia with the man who had turned the Roman Republic into his personal chaotic stage. The scent of the crowded forum, the roar of the plebs, the tension of political clashes, these were the elements of their shared world. Clodius was infamous for his theatrical defiance of tradition, a man who delighted in shocking the sensibilities of the elite. He had once disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a sacred, female-only religious ceremony in Caesar's home, a scandalous act that only seemed to raise his popularity among the common people, cementing his image as a daring rule-breaker. He later renounced his patrician status to run for the tribunate of the plebs, an office that gave him immense veto power over the Senate, allowing him to champion popular causes and obstruct the will of the establishment. Clodius understood Rome's street politics better than most, the ebb and flow of public sentiment, the power of a well-placed insult or a generous handout. And Fulvia, far from being a passive consort, a silent presence in the background, was right there beside him, actively participating, absorbing his methods, learning the nuances of wielding influence over the Roman crowds. She wasn't a silent partner. Roman sources suggest that Fulvia actively participated in her husband's political world. She engaged directly with his supporters, listening to their grievances, fostering their loyalty. She was highly visible during his campaigns, her presence signaling her endorsement and involvement, a rare sight for a woman of her standing. And she managed their household as a bustling hub for Clodius's political activities, a constant stream of allies, petitioners, and strategists passing through its doors. Together they represented a new kind of Roman power couple, bold, populist, and unapologetically aggressive, unafraid to challenge the old guard. But the alliance came at a cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death, violent and public, sent shockwaves through Rome, igniting fresh outrage. But Fulvia was not about to mourn quietly, retreating into the traditional role of a grieving widow. She staged a political funeral that historians still talk about today, a masterclass in manipulating public emotion. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, its bloodied wounds exposed for maximum effect, a horrifying spectacle designed to inflame the passions of the Roman populace. The sight of his broken body, the metallic scent of blood, the horrified gasps of the onlookers. These details ensured the memory of his death would not fade. The public was horrified and enraged by the sight of their fallen champion. Riots erupted, spontaneous and violent, fueled by grief and fury. The Senate House, the very symbol of Roman authority, was burned to the ground, a blazing testament to the people's wrath. Fulvia had turned personal grief into public uprising, a devastatingly effective display of her innate political acumen. This was her first major visible political act, and it worked, demonstrating her extraordinary ability to mobilize the masses. Her capacity to manipulate public emotion, to use spectacle as a strategic weapon, and to wield her deceased husband's legacy as a powerful call to action, made her a new kind of player in Roman politics.
Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped out of his shadow, asserting herself as a formidable force, and Rome would never see her the same way again, recognizing the dangerous power she now possessed. The ashes of the Senate House, the lingering scent of smoke, the cries of the rioting crowds, these were the stark markers of her ascent. Chapter 6. A Widow's Ambition and the Perusine War. Fulvia didn't linger in mourning, not in the traditional passive Roman sense. In Rome, political capital had a short shelf life, constantly shifting and eroding, and she understood that brutal reality better than anyone. Shortly after the violent public death of Clodius Pulcher, she entered into a second marriage, her grief transformed into strategic calculation. This time her choice was Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's most passionate and influential supporters. On the surface, Curio seemed an unlikely match. He had a flamboyant reputation, a taste for drama, and a penchant for extravagant gestures. But beneath the bravado and superficial charm was a sharp political operator, a man capable of intricate maneuvering. The hum of political gossip, the faint scent of ambition, the rustle of new alliances, these were the currents she navigated. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, Curio wielded enormous influence during one of Rome's most volatile periods. The Republic teetered precariously between war and peace, between Caesar's insatiable ambitions and the Senate's desperate, crumbling resistance. Fulvia saw in Curio not just a husband, but a bridge to the next colossal power block, a means to maintain her centrality in the unfolding drama. This was no romantic rebound. It was a calculated alliance, a strategic move on the grand chessboard of Roman power. With Clodius gone, Fulvia needed a new political anchor, someone who could carry forward the populist legacy her first husband had built, someone who had Caesar's backing, the rising star of Roman politics. Curio fit both bills, providing a vital connection to the burgeoning power of Caesar. Through him, Fulvia remained tightly embedded in the shifting power dynamics of Rome. She didn't just marry into the movement, she helped shape it, subtly guiding Curio, ensuring the continued loyalty of Clodius's formidable base of supporters. Fulvia ensured Clodius's former supporters stayed active, their collective voice a powerful force in Roman street politics. She skillfully rebranded their cause under Curio's leadership, maintaining their political cohesion. And she continued keeping the urban masses politically engaged, their cheers and murmurs a crucial barometer of public sentiment. But the Roman world was collapsing fast, its ancient structures buckling under the weight of internal conflict. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey exploded into full-blown civil war, an unholy conflict that tore the Republic apart.
Curio threw himself into the fight, unequivocally taking Caesar's side, his loyalty unwavering. Fulvia, as always, remained politically involved. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign, demonstrating her administrative acumen and her deep understanding of logistical challenges. The scent of fear, the taste of dust, the distant sounds of marching legions, these were the backdrop to their struggle. In 49 BCE, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to secure Caesar's position, a critical mission that tested his leadership. But it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by the forces of King Juba of Numidia, his army annihilated in a brutal, decisive defeat. His death was swift and merciless, a stark reminder of the fragility of life in the midst of civil war. Once again, Fulvia was widowed, her personal life intertwined with the brutal political realities of her age. And once again, Rome waited to see if she would fade into the background, retiring into the obscurity of a grieving widow. She didn't. Curio's death only solidified her status as a political widow with dangerous resilience, a woman who seemed to draw strength from adversity. She had now lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil unrest, both having died fighting for populist causes, men who had challenged the traditional elite. But Fulvia was far from finished. Her most audacious partnership and her most dramatic chapter was still to come, a testament to her unyielding will. The cold emptiness of a widowed bed, the quiet echo of absence, would only sharpen her resolve. Fulvia's third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and fiercely loyal ally of Julius Caesar. Their union, forged sometime around 47 BCE, wasn't merely a romantic attachment. It was a calculated merger of power, a strategic consolidation of influence. Fulvia had already proven herself as a master of Roman street politics, a woman who understood the raw power of the masses. Antony, rising rapidly through the military and political ranks, needed precisely that kind of savvy, on-the-ground support in Rome. Together, they formed one of the most politically potent couples of the late Republic, a formidable duo that would shake the very foundations of the state. The scent of new alliances, the sharp taste of political ambition, the constant hum of strategic maneuvering, these were the sensations of their shared existence. By the time of their marriage, Fulvia was no stranger to blood and betrayal. She had buried 2 husbands and outmaneuvered countless enemies, her resolve hardened by experience. Antony was no stranger to scandal either. He drank heavily, he gambled with reckless abandon, and his personal life was notoriously chaotic, a constant source of gossip and intrigue. But with Fulvia, he had found someone who could do more than entertain him. She could actively defend his interests, fiercely protect his reputation, hold his complex web of alliances together, and rally supporters when he was away on campaign. And Antony, despite his brash exterior and legendary appetite for excess, understood her immense value. He allowed Fulvia to exercise authority that no Roman woman had publicly wielded before, an unprecedented display of female power. She opened his correspondence, scrutinizing every letter, every dispatch. She issued orders in his absence, her voice carrying the weight of his authority. She sat in on crucial political meetings, her presence a silent challenge to the male-dominated norms, and subtly influenced appointments, ensuring loyalists were placed in key positions. Roman sources, mostly hostile and deeply misogynistic, depicted her as overbearing, shrewish, and relentlessly power-hungry. But what truly disturbed them most wasn't merely her ambition. It was that she acted like a Roman man, in a world that had no language, no category for such a woman. She defied every expectation, every cultural norm. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic was plunged into chaos once more, a vacuum of power that threatened to consume everything. Antony rushed to secure his position as Caesar's political heir, maneuvering fiercely against rivals. But it was Fulvia who held Rome itself, while Antony formed the Second Triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, cementing a fragile, uneasy alliance. Fulvia acted as his powerful representative in the capital, a constant, visible presence. She managed complex patronage networks, coordinating with street gangs, and ensuring Antony's supporters remained mobilized and ready to act.
The cold, hard reality of power, the sharp taste of betrayal, the metallic scent of conflict, these were the textures of her daily life. She even helped arrange Antony's official reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter Clodia to him, a strategic alliance that would later implode in public spectacle. In public, Fulvia appeared not just as Antony's wife, a mere domestic partner, but as his powerful proxy, a visible symbol of his authority. Roman coins were even minted bearing both Antony's image and her name, an unprecedented acknowledgement of her status as a political agent, not just a consort. She wasn't hidden in the shadows of power. She stood in its full blinding glare, challenging every Roman expectation of female conduct. But power in Rome was always borrowed, always precarious, and Fulvia was about to test the limits of how far a woman could go before Rome snapped back, violently reasserting its patriarchal norms. Her bold defiance, the quiet stance in her stance, the unyielding gaze in her eyes, these signaled a woman ready to push boundaries. While Mark Antony pursued military campaigns and political deals across the vast Roman world, his attention often turned eastward. It was Fulvia who controlled the streets of Rome, a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of allies and enemies. She wasn't just his wife, she was his regent in all but name, a living embodiment of his authority in the heart of the Republic. In a period where violence, bribery, and raw influence kept order, where might made right and alliances shifted like sand, Fulvia proved she could play the game as well as, if not better, than any man in the Senate. The roar of the crowds, the clatter of weapons, the murmur of whispered conspiracies, these were the sounds of her domain. Rome, in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's assassination, was a battlefield without swords, a landscape of political maneuver, where power had become a constantly moving target, elusive and dangerous. Fulvia understood this inherently, instinctively, and she anchored Antony's authority in the capital by becoming his unwavering political substitute, a constant, forceful presence. She directed allies with firm authority, dealt directly with the urban plebs, understanding their needs and grievances, negotiated with various factions, her words carefully chosen, and most daringly waged war with words and silver. She financed loyal troops, ensuring their unwavering allegiance, offered strategic bribes to keep public order and maintain support, and ensured that any legislation passed favored Antony's future ambitions. The metallic taste of freshly minted coins, the rustle of official documents, the feel of rough hands clasped in alliance, these were the textures of her power.
Some ancient sources, especially those hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as a manipulative, shrewish figure, even a warmongering woman, driven by an insatiable lust for power. But beneath the misogynistic exaggeration lies the undeniable truth of a woman actively doing politics, shaping events in a world that had no protocol, no framework for a woman doing anything beyond weaving and mourning. Her sharp gaze, the subtle tightening of her lips, the quiet authority in her posture, these challenged every male assumption. Fulvia was building coalitions, backing military commanders with strategic support, and even issuing decrees, functions normally reserved for senators and consuls, positions of immense male power. She also made frequent public appearances, ensuring her visibility, and maintained strong relationships with veteran soldiers, a politically vital demographic in the brutal power struggles of the late Republic. Her voice, clear and commanding, resonated with those who had served Caesar. While Antony was campaigning in the East, distracted by military matters and the allure of Cleopatra, Fulvia was often the face of his authority in Italy, a constant, visible reminder of his presence. She met with centurions, influencing decisions about land distribution, a matter of paramount importance to the soldiers, and constantly reminded the soldiers that their loyalty to Antony came with rewards, both tangible and intangible. The rough, calloused hands of the soldiers, the glint of their armor, the smell of dust and sweat, these were the everyday realities of her interactions. But this accumulation of power came at a cost, a steep price in a society resistant to female authority. Roman aristocrats, particularly the faction aligned with Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, resented Fulvia's influence. They viewed her as a meddling woman with far too much sway over legions, laws, and loyalties. Her ability to act without male guardianship was not just threatening, it was unprecedented, a direct challenge to the very foundation of their patriarchal society. The quiet murmur of disapproval, the sharp hostile glances, the feeling of invisible walls closing in, these were the signs of growing resentment. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was growing, a palpable force that could erupt at any moment. She could see that their fragile alliance was cracking, like ancient pottery under immense pressure, and she understood something that neither man seemed to fully grasp yet. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So Fulvia began preparing for the next phase, not diplomacy, which had clearly failed, but direct confrontation. She had stood behind power long enough. Now she was ready to take it into her own hands, to wield it directly, even if it meant risking everything. The cold resolve in her heart, the firm set of her jaw, these were the inner preparations for a coming storm. In 41 BCE, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, the man who would reshape the Roman world. And she didn't do it quietly from the shadows or through proxies. With her husband, Mark Antony, still stationed in the East, embroiled in military campaigns and the seductive, distracting world of Cleopatra, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's younger brother and a consul, took it upon themselves to challenge Octavian's authority in Italy. The cause, ostensibly, was to defend Antony's interests and protect the land rights of Roman veterans loyal to him, a politically volatile issue. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was not just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman, the first and only time in Roman history that a woman would actively provoke and organize a civil war. The clash of swords, the shouts of soldiers, the taste of dust and desperation, these were the brutal realities of her gamble. The conflict, which became known as the Perusine War, was triggered by Octavian's controversial land redistribution program, which displaced many Italians to reward his soldiers, creating immense resentment and unrest. Fulvia shrewdly seized on the growing discontent, portraying Octavian as a tyrant and traitor to Caesar's legacy, a man betraying the very ideals they claimed to uphold. With Lucius acting as her frontman in the Senate, making the public pronouncements, and Fulvia organizing behind the scenes, pulling the strings of finance and logistics, they raised 8 legions and seized the formidable city of Perusia, modern-day Perugia. Make no mistake, this was Fulvia's war, her strategic vision and relentless will driving the conflict forward. Ancient sources suggest she was more invested in the conflict than Lucius himself, her passion burning brighter. She rallied troops with fiery speeches, stirred the public with compelling rhetoric, and even corresponded with generals, issuing orders and coordinating movements, demonstrating her remarkable military acumen. The cold, metallic feel of sword hilts, the rough texture of soldiers' tunics, the acrid scent of campfires, these were the sensory details of her command. Rome buzzed with rumors of her commanding legions, issuing orders directly to officers and forcing Lucius into confrontations he didn't want, his brother often appearing hesitant in comparison to her fierce determination. Octavian, though initially surprised by the audacity of Fulvia's actions, acted quickly and decisively. He besieged Perusia through the harsh winter of 4140 BCE, cutting off supplies and systematically hammering the city into submission. The biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the constant rumble of siege engines, the taste of despair, these were the torments of the besieged. Fulvia, stuck between dwindling food supplies, the constant threat of starvation, and the bitter taste of political betrayal, watched her bold gamble unravel, piece by agonizing piece. By early 40 BCE, after months of suffering, the city surrendered, its inhabitants gaunt and defeated. Lucius Antonius was spared, likely as a calculated gesture to avoid alienating Mark Antony entirely, a clear sign of political expediency. But Fulvia was exiled, banished from Roman soil, deemed too dangerous for the republic she had dared to challenge. The woman who had once commanded riots, manipulated marriages, inspired armies, and swayed public opinion, was now broken, banished, and alone. She was sent to Sicyon in Greece, a city of quiet exile, where she desperately hoped to reunite with Antony. But Antony didn't come running, not immediately. The once powerful alliance between husband and wife had eroded in the fog of war and distance, their shared purpose fragmented. Fulvia had acted in his name, believing she was protecting his interests, but perhaps she had done so without his blessing, overstepping a boundary he could not forgive. She had dared to do what no Roman woman had before, wage a civil war. And now the Republic, in its swift, unforgiving retribution, had made her pay the ultimate price for her temerity. The bitter taste of betrayal, the cold chill of abandonment, the profound silence of exile, these were her final companions. Chapter 7. The Dream Takes Form and Lingers. Banished from Rome, a city she had fought to shape and control, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a coastal city in Greece that had become a kind of diplomatic purgatory for failed power players and political exiles. The scent of salt air and distant olive groves, the quiet lapping of waves against the shore, These were the gentle sounds of her forced solitude. She had gone to war not for personal gain, but in her husband's name, to preserve his interests and perhaps her own vision of a populist Rome. She believed she was defending Mark Antony's interests, his honor, and perhaps their shared vision of Rome, a city less dominated by rigid aristocratic norms. But what awaited her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome or a tearful reunion. It was silence, profound and crushing. The absence of Antony's voice, the lack of his reassuring presence, spoke volumes. Fulvia had risked everything, her status, her vast alliances, her very life, throwing herself into the maelstrom of civil war. And yet Antony did not immediately rush to meet her. In fact, by the time Fulvia arrived in Greece, Antony was already entangled with Cleopatra in Egypt, drawn by her intelligence, her charm, and her immense resources. Whether their romantic relationship had fully begun or was merely brewing, the symbolism was crushing, a stark betrayal of Fulvia's loyalty.
While Fulvia was raising legions in Italy, enduring siege and starvation, Antony was raising goblets at banquets beside a queen, luxuriating in the Nile's opulence. The taste of betrayal cut deep, not just personally, but politically, a bitter pill to swallow. The feel of the warm Egyptian sun on Antony's face, so far from the cold, damp walls of Perusia, would highlight the immense gulf between them. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, suggest that Antony was furious with her for launching the Perusine War without his direct, explicit approval, viewing it as an impulsive act that complicated his political standing. Others argue he welcomed her downfall, as it cleared the way for a crucial marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would have never tolerated, a political necessity that required her absence. Still, Fulvia wasn't entirely without supporters. Some Antony's troops, fiercely loyal to her for her direct engagement and strong leadership, urged reconciliation. But her health had begun to fail. After enduring siege, the arduous journey of exile, and the crushing weight of betrayal, Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BCE, possibly from illness exacerbated by stress and heartbreak, or perhaps from all three combined. She was around 43 years old, her formidable life cut tragically short. The quiet stillness of her final breath, the cool touch of death on her skin, marked the end of an extraordinary, defiant life. Her death provided Antony with a clean political exit, a convenient way to extricate himself from a complicated alliance. He met with Octavian shortly afterwards and agreed to marry Octavian's sister, Octavia, as part of a renewed peace treaty, a calculated move to stabilize the triumvirate. The triumvirs were temporarily united again, their fragile alliance reinforced, but only because Fulvia, the one woman bold enough to challenge their designs and disrupt their power games, was gone.
Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, whose myths and legends would eclipse nearly every Roman woman of the period. But make no mistake, Fulvia was the prototype. She didn't wield power from behind a curtain. She marched into it, stood at the very center, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women as little more than furniture, extensions of their male relatives. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it tried to erase her, to paint her as a shrewish anomaly. But the ashes of her rebellion would linger, a faint, acrid scent of defiance, and her story was far from ordinary. The cold silence that followed her death was Rome's attempt to forget, but history would remember. Fulvia's story ends in silence, the quiet, ignored passing of a once forceful figure. But her legacy is anything but quiet. In the centuries that followed her death, historians and writers, Mostly men, steeped in patriarchal norms, struggled to place her in Rome's grand narrative. Because Fulvia broke every rule of what a Roman woman was supposed to be. She didn't just advise power from the shadows, offering demure counsel. She became power, actively wielding it, directly challenging the male establishment. And that made her both unforgettable and deeply unsettling to a patriarchal world that thrived on rigid gender roles. In a society where women were expected to influence through whispered suggestions and strategic marriages, Fulvia shouted through policy, through war, and through bold political theatre. She was not a consort. She was a commander, a strategist, a force. And yet she was remembered more for her defiance than her accomplishments. Roman historians couldn't handle a woman who didn't stay in her place, who dared to act like a man, so they rewrote her as shrill, power-hungry, and disruptive, a negative example. But read between the lines, delve into the subtle nuances of the texts, and a different figure emerges.
Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name, a profound, unprecedented declaration of her independent political agency. She organized political factions, leveraging loyalty and influence. She used marriage as a tactical weapon, forging alliances. And she manipulated Roman street politics with stunning effectiveness, understanding the hearts and minds of the common people. She moved through the brutal civil wars of the 1st century BCE not as a bystander or a victim, but as a player, a strategic force. A woman whose influence terrified senators and shaped the fate of triumvirs, men who held the destiny of Rome in their hands. The sharp tang of ambition, the faint scent of betrayal, the pervasive feeling of political tension, these were the constant companions of her life. Her downfall wasn't due to incompetence. It was due to timing and, most significantly, gender. Had she been born a man, she might have been remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato, a hero or a respected rival. Instead, she was cast as the wicked woman who dared too much, a cautionary tale. Still, her legacy quietly lingered, a subtle influence. Later Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra herself, though of a different world, would all operate in the shadow Fulvia helped carve. They would manipulate emperors, wield armies, and control succession, pushing the boundaries of female power. But Fulvia did it first, and with no imperial title or divine status to shield her. The cold, unyielding power of the state, the whispers of male disapproval, were constant threats. Today, modern historians have begun re-examining Fulvia with fresh eyes, peeling back the layers of misogynistic caricature. No longer a mere cautionary tale, she is being recognized as one of the most politically active, powerful, and influential women in Roman history. Someone who tested the boundaries of female power to their absolute limit and paid the price. She didn't simply live in the age of triumvirs. She challenged them, directly and unequivocally. And while Rome may have tried to erase her, to silence her memory, Fulvia left fingerprints in every corner of its collapse, an indelible mark. Not a footnote, but a force. A woman centuries ahead of her time, her defiance echoing through the annals of history. The faint metallic scent of iron, the smooth, cool feel of a Roman coin, the distant murmur of a crowd. These small details carry the weight of her extraordinary story. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds, one rooted in centuries-old systems of oppression built on racial hierarchy and brutal injustice, and another aching to breathe free,
yearning for equality and dignity. In the Deep South, segregation wasn't just a social norm, it was the law, enforced with violence and intimidation. Black Americans were barred from restaurants, their hunger ignored. Schools, their minds denied education. Buses, their bodies relegated to the back. Voting booths, their voices silenced. And even drinking fountains, their thirst denied. The pervasive smell of fear, the sharp taste of injustice clung to the very air. Police brutality was rampant, a terrifying constant in their lives, and lynching still occurred, a chilling reminder of unchecked racial violence. And in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters were being met with snarling dogs, their teeth bared, and high-pressure fire hoses, their powerful streams knocking people to the ground. The cold, wet spray, the harsh barks of the dogs, the screams of the protesters, these were the sounds and sensations of the brutal resistance to change. But change was coming, a powerful, unstoppable tide, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement had surged into the national spotlight, its demands growing louder, its moral force undeniable. Sit-ins, freedom rides and boycotts had become familiar headlines, words that galvanized some and terrified others. Leaders like Rosa Parks, her quiet defiance a powerful spark. Medgar Evers, his courage cut short by an assassin's bullet. And John Lewis, his young voice a clarion call for justice. These were no longer just names. They were symbols of defiance, icons of courage in the face of immense repression. The March on Washington wasn't born out of a single conversation. It was the result of rising frustration, decades of simmering anger, and fierce, unyielding hope. The collective sigh of a nation yearning for justice, the quiet hum of anticipation, these were the sounds that prefaced the march. Black Americans were no longer content with waiting. They were demanding civil rights, not as a request, but as a right. And they were determined to make their voices heard where it mattered most, the nation's capital, the seat of power. The idea of a mass march in Washington, D.C. had been floating around for decades. A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, had originally proposed the concept in the 1940s. Back then, it was meant to pressure the Roosevelt administration to desegregate the defense industry. That protest was called off after Roosevelt caved and signed an executive order, a small victory that postponed the larger reckoning. But now, in 1963, the stakes were even higher, the need more urgent. Randolph, along with other seminal civil rights leaders, including the brilliant strategist Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs. They were marching for dignity, for voting rights, for school desegregation, for equal pay, and, most importantly, for the basic human right to live free. Over a dozen major civil rights organizations came together to plan it, despite their many disagreements and strategic clashes, because they understood the immense power of a unified front. The countdown had begun. Buses were being organized, their engines humming with purpose. Flyers were spreading word, passing from hand to hand. Word of mouth was moving faster than newspapers, a whisper that became a roar. And across the country, Black Americans were preparing for what would become one of the most unforgettable moments in American history. The dream was taking shape, one footstep at a time, each step a testament to courage and hope. The faint smell of anticipation, the palpable feeling of collective determination filled the air. Pulling off a protest of any kind in Washington, D.C. was no small feat. The logistical challenges were immense. But planning one for over 100,000 people, possibly more, was madness, a monumental undertaking that seemed impossible. Logistically, it sounded like a nightmare. How to manage food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, and safety plans for such a vast multitude. And yet, somehow, they made it happen, a testament to sheer willpower and meticulous organization. The crisp snap of newly printed permits, the rhythmic hum of phone lines as arrangements were made. These were the subtle sounds of planning. At the center of this controlled chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and often kept behind the scenes for political reasons to avoid controversy, was a master strategist, a brilliant tactician. Rustin had once studied non-violence directly under Mahatma Gandhi's followers in India, absorbing the philosophy and practical applications of peaceful resistance. He had marched, been jailed, beaten, and surveilled relentlessly by the FBI, but nothing fazed him. His resolve was unbreakable. He saw the March on Washington as a chance to show the world what disciplined, non-violent protest could truly achieve when coordinated with military precision. The taste of victory, though distant, was a powerful motivator. In just 8 short weeks, Rustin and his dedicated team transformed the ambitious idea into a tangible reality. The march was officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and it was deliberately framed to include both racial justice and economic opportunity, recognizing the interconnectedness of these struggles. That dual message was no accident. While Dr. King would later become the spiritual symbol of the day, his powerful words resonating across the globe, it was Randolph and Rustin who made sure the demands were just as much about unemployment, minimum wage, and workers' rights as they were about civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered beneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were nervous, deeply nervous. They feared riots, a violent backlash, or worse, bloodshed in the nation's capital, which would derail their legislative agenda. Civil rights leaders assured them the protest would be peaceful, a disciplined demonstration of moral force. Still, the National Guard was on standby, their presence a silent, tense reminder of potential conflict. Hospitals in D.C. were put on alert, preparing for any eventuality, and liquor sales were banned for the day in an effort to curb any potential unrest. Federal workers were even told they could stay home, their absence a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the event. The scent of fear and caution was palpable in the corridors of power. And then there was the question of unity. The Big Six civil rights organizations, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, often clashed over tactics, their leaders having different approaches. Some wanted more radical, direct action. Others preferred a more diplomatic, legislative approach. SNCC's young firebrands, impatient with the slow pace of change, were growing increasingly disillusioned with King's non-violent approach, feeling it was too slow, too passive. But they all agreed on this: the time for silence had passed. Rustin's plan read like a military operation, precise and comprehensive. Every bus and train was tracked. Every speaker was timed to the minute. Every route had marshals trained in crowd control, ensuring order and safety. They weren't just planning a march, they were orchestrating a moment that would shake the conscience of a nation, a pivotal point in American history. The quiet click of typewriters, the rustle of maps, the low murmur of strategic discussions. These were the sounds of history being meticulously planned. August 28, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. The sun was already hot by 9 a.m., beating down with oppressive intensity, and the humidity clung to the skin like a second shirt, making every breath heavy. But it didn't stop them. From every corner of the country they came, black, white, young, old, students, clergy, factory workers, and celebrities. Some wore their Sunday best, their clothes crisp despite the heat. Others clutched protest signs, their messages clear and defiant. They came by bus, train, carpool, and even foot. Over 250,000 people in total, converging on the National Mall like a rising tide of hope, a human river flowing towards a shared destination. The murmur of countless conversations, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, the distant hum of arriving buses, these sounds filled the humid air. And yet there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of riots and unrest, the scene was astonishingly calm, imbued with a quiet dignity. Volunteers directed foot traffic with gentle hands and clear voices. The Red Cross handed out water, its cool liquid a welcome relief. Groups sang freedom songs, their voices rising in harmonious unity. People held hands, strangers connected by a shared purpose, and cheered as new marchers arrived, a ripple of excitement spreading through the crowd. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool, their voices soaring, and chants of jobs and freedom echoing off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial, a powerful, resonant sound. Celebrities joined in too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was there for autographs. They were there to witness history and lend their voices to a cause bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but energized, a palpable sense of purpose permeating the vast gathering. There was no pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, there was a shared understanding that this wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment, a collective pilgrimage towards justice. The feeling of shared purpose, the quiet hum of collective anticipation, made the heat almost bearable. For many black Americans, just standing on the mall, surrounded by so many faces reflecting their own hopes, felt like a quiet act of revolution. To be seen, truly seen, for the first time by the nation. To be counted, their numbers undeniable. To say, "We are here," in front of the same Lincoln Memorial where the great emancipator sat in stone, his silent gaze fixed on them. It was a full circle moment, generations in the making, a powerful connection between past and present. At exactly noon, the official program began. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different organizations, ideologies, and regions, but united in their message. Speakers demanded equal pay, their voices clear and strong. Desegregated schools, their calls ringing out. A living wage, an economic justice, and an end to police brutality, an end to terror. Mahalia Jackson sang, her powerful voice soaring over the crowd, a spiritual anthem.
Marian Anderson, who had once been banned from singing at Constitutional Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands beneath the open sky, her voice a testament to dignity and perseverance. As the hours passed, the tension grew, not from unrest, but from anticipation, a hushed reverence. The man everyone was waiting for had not yet spoken, and when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember.
The march wasn't just making history, it was becoming legend, minute by minute, breath by breath. The collective sigh of the crowd, the low murmur of anticipation, filled the humid air. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had grown quiet, not because they were tired, but because they knew what was coming. A hush fell over the vast expanse of people, a palpable sense of expectation. Standing in the shade of the Lincoln Memorial, its cool stone a silent witness, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, neatly tied tie, and an expression of deep calm that barely concealed the fire building inside him, a righteous passion that had driven him through years of struggle. He carried prepared remarks, carefully typed and written collaboratively with his advisers the night before, a meticulously crafted statement. But what the world would remember wasn't what had been typed. It was what came from his heart, an impromptu burst of eloquence. The faint click of the microphone turning on, the rustle of his papers were the last sounds before his voice filled the air. He began with measured intensity, his voice a steady, rhythmic cadence, outlining the grim realities of segregation, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon, a preacher's rhythm captivating his congregation. He used repetition, rhythm, and powerful silences, not as fillers, but as instruments, shaping the emotional landscape of his words. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some nodding in agreement, some wiping away tears that streamed down their faces, others holding signs that simply read, "Now." But it was what happened next that changed the tone of the entire event and, arguably, the trajectory of the civil rights movement itself. Standing just behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day, her powerful voice still echoing in the memory of the crowd. She suddenly cried out, a powerful, spontaneous plea. "Tell them about the dream, Martin! Tell them about the dream!" And King did. He set aside his notes, gripped the podium, his knuckles white, and launched into a passage he'd delivered before, but never like this, never with such power and immediacy. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in, a collective intake of breath. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Each phrase rang louder, clearer, more resolute, building in intensity like a rising tide. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." It wasn't a speech anymore. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history, striking at the very core of American identity. The power of his voice, resonating with conviction, filled the vast space. By the time King closed with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Applause thundered, tears flowed freely, shouts of joy mingled with sobs of profound emotion. They knew they had just witnessed something more than oratory. They had heard prophecy, a glimpse into a better future. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music, it was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity gathered that day was overwhelming, a sea of faces stretching as far as the eye could see. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and everywhere in between, from dusty rural towns to bustling metropolises. Some were seasoned activists who had marched a dozen times before, their faces etched with the lines of past struggles. Others had never left their hometowns until now, their journey a terrifying leap of faith. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in their church clothes, their bodies aching just to be there. Many were ordinary people, maids, teachers, steelworkers, postal clerks, who saw themselves not as political figures, but as witnesses, as participants in a moment that transcended the everyday. They didn't just want change, they were the change, the living embodiment of transformation. The warmth of shared humanity, the taste of hope, the sounds of collective joy, these were the profound sensations of that day. There were also children in the crowd, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, their eyes wide with wonder. Boys with hand-drawn signs, their small hands clutching them tightly. Parents hoisted toddlers onto their shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speakers' voices carried over loudspeakers. To them, this wasn't just an event, it was the beginning of a new world, a world where their dreams might someday be realized. Some faces stood out. There was a young John Lewis, just 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. His original speech had been so fiery, so uncompromising in its demand for radical change, that senior leaders asked him to tone it down minutes before he went on stage, fearing it would alienate political allies.
He agreed, but just barely. His call for radical change still shook the crowd, a bold challenge to the status quo. The fervent passion in his voice, the determined set of his jaw, resonated deeply. And then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement on behalf of other civil rights women. The organizers had faced criticism for sidelining female voices, despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, who had been the backbone of the movement. Bates's brief but powerful message underscored a harsh reality. Even within a movement about equality, some voices still struggled to be heard. Some hierarchies remained stubbornly in place. The quiet murmurs of support, the subtle nods of recognition acknowledged her unique position. Also present were union organizers, their banners fluttering, rabbis, their robes solemn, nuns, their faces serene, priests, their collars stark, and students of every background, their idealism burning bright. They didn't all agree on strategy. Some favored King's nonviolence, others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant posture. But for that one day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won out, a powerful, fragile triumph. It was a visual symphony of American possibility. White and black hands linked in solidarity, Freedom Now buttons pinned to chests, and the sound of 250,000 souls breathing as one, a single, powerful exhalation of hope. The faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold, they were shaping it, their presence a testament to courage. And none of them would ever forget what they saw, what they felt, what they heard on that sweltering August day. The scent of hot asphalt, of sweat, of hope, these combined to create an unforgettable aroma. While the world saw unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple.
What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was in truth held together with string, sweat, and a lot of last-minute compromise. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to battle not just logistics, but deeply entrenched politics. He was constantly under scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, identities that made him a target for government surveillance, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity would be used to discredit the movement as a whole. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had once threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and Dr. King of being lovers if King didn't remove Rustin from an earlier campaign. That chilling threat haunted every stage of planning, a constant reminder of the insidious ways personal lives could be weaponized. The taste of anxiety, sharp and metallic, would have been a constant companion. Then there was the issue of women's voices. Despite the critical roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, who organized, strategized, and led from the front lines, none were invited to deliver major speeches on their own. Rosa Parks was in the crowd that day, revered by all, but she was not given the microphone. Behind the powerful optics of the march lay the truth. The movement still struggled with its own hierarchies and blind spots, a reflection of the larger society it sought to change. The quiet murmur of discontent, the feeling of subtle exclusion, would have been present even amidst the joy. Even within the Big Six organizations, friction bubbled. SNCC leaders were growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of change and the older generation's insistence on moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism more aggressively, demanding immediate, revolutionary shifts. CORE had similar frustrations, but unity was deemed too important, just for one day, a fragile peace maintained for the sake of a larger goal.
The sound of hushed arguments, the subtle tension in group meetings, would have been a constant undercurrent. Meanwhile, the federal government watched with clenched teeth. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned over 100 agents to spy on organizers, their movements tracked, their conversations recorded. They bugged hotel rooms, followed key figures, and compiled dossiers, convinced the march would turn violent or that communists would hijack the event. When nothing of the sort happened, when the march proved to be impeccably peaceful and orderly, they simply doubled down on their surveillance, especially of Dr. King, seeing his power as an increasing threat. The subtle click of a hidden recorder, the low hum of distant surveillance equipment, these were the unseen sounds of government intrusion. And let's not forget money. The march cost over $250,000, equivalent to millions today, a vast sum to raise in a short period. Most of it was raised through unions and sympathetic donors, but organizers scrambled until the final hour, their pockets stretched thin. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts, a humble detail amidst the grandeur of the event. The March on Washington was historic, yes, but it was also deeply human, imperfect, messy, political, and ultimately unfinished, just like the country it sought to heal. The scent of ambition, the taste of hope, the feeling of exhaustion, these permeated the air of that momentous day. The sun began to dip behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed, casting long, fading shadows across the mall. People hugged, some cried, others sang softly, their voices lingering in the twilight. They lingered as long as they could, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground, a space transformed by collective will. But the march was over. The speeches had been delivered, the signs had been raised high, the world had watched. And now the question hung heavy in the humid August air. What happens next? The quiet shuffle of footsteps, the faint murmur of parting conversations, the distant hum of buses departing. These sounds marked the end of the public spectacle.
In the immediate days that followed, the media reaction was cautiously positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, though often with a tone of detached curiosity, focusing on the orderliness rather than the radical demands. Some called it orderly and dignified, which was thinly veiled code for no one rioted. Few outlets gave much space to the specific demands of the march, like the call for a federal jobs program or a $2 minimum wage, equivalent to around $20 today. Crucial economic justice issues often overlooked. But everyone covered Dr. King's speech. That, at least, could not be ignored. Its power resonated far beyond the mall. The crackle of radio news, the rustle of turning newspaper pages, filled homes across the nation. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, fearing its potential for chaos, watched it unfold on television with growing admiration and perhaps surprise. He called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House immediately afterward, listening intently to their demands. But legislative movement remained slow. His proposed Civil Rights Act was still stalled in Congress, caught in the mire of Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed, their hope for immediate action unmet. They had hoped the march would result in immediate, tangible change. Instead, it was back to the grind, organizing, marching, resisting, and mourning those who paid the ultimate price for justice. The bitter taste of slow progress, the lingering scent of unfulfilled promises, these were the realities they faced. Just weeks later, that reality hit hard. On September 15, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, a horrific act of domestic terrorism. The dream had been voiced, yes, but the nightmare wasn't over. In fact, it deepened. Still, something had fundamentally changed. The March on Washington marked a new phase in the civil rights movement. It proved that mass protest could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore, a moral force that could not be silenced. It brought together a coalition broader than ever before: labor unions, faith leaders, celebrities, students, and working-class Americans, all in one place, united by justice. And most of all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed across the world for generations to come. The march was over, but the road was just beginning, a long, arduous path that would soon lead through blood, through legislation, and through profound transformation. The distant hum of struggle, the unwavering beat of a collective heart, would continue to reverberate. The March on Washington didn't just rattle the conscience of America. It reshaped its moral landscape. What had begun as an audacious act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how Americans understood justice, democracy, and the immense power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march didn't yield immediate victories, but it created an undeniable momentum, a moral imperative that pressured lawmakers. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed, striking at the very heart of Jim Crow laws, dismantling decades of systemic disenfranchisement. Would these bills have passed without the march? Possibly. But would they have had the same moral force,
The same undeniable public pressure? The same resonance? Probably not. The rustle of paper as the bills were signed, the quiet triumph, was a direct consequence of the roar on the Mall. For Martin Luther King, Jr., the speech that day propelled him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon, a moral voice for freedom worldwide. But fame came with a terrible cost: relentless surveillance, constant threats, and ultimately assassination in 1968, a tragic end to a visionary life. The dream he spoke of on those steps would become more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with each passing year, a constant beacon of hope and a reminder of unfinished work. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for large-scale mobilization, a practical guide for future protests. And it inspired a generation of activists, both in the US and abroad. Anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders across the globe would cite the March on Washington as a model, a testament to the power of peaceful demonstration. The distant echo of chants, the soft rustle of protest signs, would reverberate across continents. But the legacy isn't just historical. It continues to live and breathe in the present. The language of the march, the idea of jobs and freedom, the powerful image of peaceful resistance, the echoes of "I have a dream," still pulses through modern protest. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, echoes of 1963 reverberate with every chant and every cardboard sign. In Washington, D.C. today, King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin from the Lincoln Memorial, a towering likeness carved in stone, with words from that August day etched into the granite. But the real memorial isn't in stone. It's in classrooms, in voting booths, in every march, and in every voice refusing to stay silent. Because the dream wasn't meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived, to be fought for, to be realized. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that, to continue the march towards a more just and equitable world. The enduring scent of hope, the feeling of unyielding determination remain palpable. More than 60 years have passed since that summer afternoon when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits, its images and sounds etched into the collective memory. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools, his voice steady and strong, echoing in national memory like a sacred refrain, a beacon of hope and a call to action. But for many, the question remains: has the dream been realized, or has it merely been delayed? The quiet hum of ongoing struggle, the persistent murmur of unresolved issues, these continue to be heard. In some ways, progress is undeniable. The legal framework of segregation was systematically dismantled, piece by painful piece. Voting rights, though now under fresh assault in many states through new legislative efforts, were won through blood, through marches, and through tireless court battles. The presence of black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unthinkable in 1963, a testament to the transformative power of the movement. Interracial marriage, once illegal in much of the country, is now protected by federal law, a triumph of human rights over prejudice. These are not small things. They are victories carved out by relentless struggle and profound sacrifice. The taste of these hard-won freedoms, though still bittersweet, is real.
And yet the original demands of the march, the ones often overshadowed by King's iconic speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage, for economic justice, remains unmet for countless Americans. Racial disparities in education, in housing, in employment, and in healthcare remain entrenched, persistent inequalities that continue to burden marginalized communities. Police brutality, the very thing that sparked much of the early civil rights organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest, a stark reminder of unchecked power. The dream of true economic justice, of a country where opportunity is not predetermined by zip code or skin color, is still far from reality. The feeling of ongoing struggle, the palpable frustration with slow change, are ever present. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often using the imagery and rhetoric of the 1963 march as both inspiration and indictment, connecting their present struggles to a powerful historical lineage. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, and demand the same basic human rights, freedom, dignity, equality, that were demanded decades ago. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, which amplifies their voices and their struggles, by pervasive surveillance, and by new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the conclusion. It was a flashpoint, a stake in the ground that said, this is who we are, and this is what we demand. It was a declaration, not a resolution, a beginning, not an end. The insistent hum of digital communication, the bright glow of phone screens, the crisp sound of new protest songs, these are the textures of modern activism. So the dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive, a flickering flame that refuses to be extinguished.
Whether it is deferred, distorted, or one day fulfilled, depends not on the past, but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we summon to march again and again, to speak out, to organize, until the dream becomes a shared, lived reality for all. The quiet strength of collective will, the persistent scent of hope, these are the legacies that endure. Good night, sweet dreams, rest well.